Hello and welcome to the Shakespeare podcast. Today we'll be looking at the life and works of Mr. William Shakespeare and asking the question, where did Shakespeare come from? What we know about Shakespeare is very limited. He was born in April in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, a small backwater of a town that would have been completely unknown even to people in England. He was buried in the same town in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1616. He wrote either 36 plays or 39 plays, depending on who you listen to, and he also wrote some poetry. His plays were not published to any great extent until 1623, some 7 years after he died. That publication is known as the First Folio, and it was published in 1623. There were 36 plays in the First Folio. To give you some idea of how we know about Shakespeare's work, there was a second edition in 1632, and then a third edition in 1663 and a fourth in 1685. Throughout the 18th century, the 1700s, there was an edition of Shakespeare published every 10 years, and by the time you get to the beginning of the 1800s, there are literally dozens of editions of Shakespeare being published in England, in America, and in Germany year after year after year. But about Shakespeare the man, the actual person who wrote the plays, we know very little about him. He's basically just a name. So there are plenty of authors, plenty of writers who came before Shakespeare that we know quite a lot about their lives. But when it comes to Shakespeare, we have, for example, no private letters. There's no record of his conversations. There's no authentic personal reminiscences of him that remain from the time when he was living. And even the picture that you have of Shakespeare is supposed to have come from a death mask that was made on his death in 1616. It is said of Shakespeare's scholars that, quote, they fringe an inch of fact with acres of conjecture. And that's perfectly true. Almost all the stories, and indeed some of the things that are represented to people as facts, are not facts at all. They're conjectures at best, or just straight lies at worst. A good example of this is, if you look up Shakespeare on Wikipedia, it will tell you that Shakespeare was born on the 23rd of April 1564, and that he died on the 23rd of April 1616. That's not true. None of that is true. It's conjecture. The 23rd of April as a date is chosen because it's the same date as St. George's Day, and St. George is the patron saint of England. The idea being that Shakespeare was born on St. George's Day and died on St. George's Day. We don't know that to be true. It's just conjecture. What we know is that he was born in April because his baptism is in the parish records. What we know is that he died in April 1616 because his funeral is in the parish records in Stratford. His actual date of birth or his actual date of death is unknown to us. It's merely conjecture that he died or was born on the 23rd. Now, for many writers, this isn't a problem because most writers leave some clues to their own life and their own personality in their writings, in their plays, in their poems, in their novels. And on that count, Shakespeare is the least egotistical of all writers. It would appear that we have almost nothing about Shakespeare's life from his writings. In the sonnets, in Shakespeare's sonnets, we have some indication of his feelings or his ideas when he was a young man, when he wrote the sonnets, but not a huge amount to go on. Again, it's an inch of fact and it's an acre of conjecture. So here's what we can say with certainty about William Shakespeare. We can say that he was born in Stratford-upon-Avon. We can say that he was married and that he had children. We know that he went to London when he was about 23 or 24. We know that he became an actor, and we also know that he wrote some plays and a little bit of poetry. We know that he returned to Stratford-upon-Avon when he was about 50 years old. We know that he lived maybe 2 or 3 years after that. We know that he made a will, we know that he died, and we know that he was buried in Stratford-upon-Avon. And once you've said that about Shakespeare, you've pretty much said everything you can say with certainty about Shakespeare, the man. What we can say is how Shakespeare fitted in with his own times, how he fitted in with his contemporaries and with other writers and actors. The theatre at this time was just starting. In fact, the first building that was used specifically to stage drama and nothing else was called the theatre, and that's where we get the word from. The Globe, where Shakespeare's plays were performed, was the second specific building used for drama. So it was a small world in London at that time. It's highly likely that Shakespeare may have been friends with the playwright Christopher Marlowe, the author of Dr. Faustus and Timburlaine. But that's just conjecture. It's more likely that he was friends with another playwright, Ben Jonson, the author of Volpone and Every Man in His Humour. And the reason why his friendship with Ben Jonson is more factual is because shortly after Shakespeare died, Ben Jonson wrote a poem about it called On the Death of Mr. William Shakespeare, the Late Playwright and Poet. Now, there's a couple of reasons why the title of this poem is important. The first one is that Ben Jonson called Shakespeare a poet, not just a playwright, but also a poet. In Shakespeare's day, being a playwright wasn't considered a very important artistic activity. It was something that everybody went to see. It was a place that was very public. There were lots of troubles where plays were performed, fights broke out, people had their pockets picked. It was a dangerous place to hang out. So being a playwright wasn't really a very high artistic ideal. But being a poet was, of course, one of the highest artistic ideals. According to the ancient Greeks, poetry, like sculpture, is the first art. And so, by calling Shakespeare a poet, Ben Jonson is putting Shakespeare on a pedestal that most people wouldn't have done. The other thing that's important about the title of the poem is that it reminds people who William Shakespeare was. This is 1616. Shakespeare had only been, quote, retired from the theatre for 2 or 3 years. And yet in those 2 or 3 years, almost everybody had forgotten who William Shakespeare was. And so Ben Jonson, in writing a poem about his death, had to remind his audience, his readers, who was William Shakespeare in the first place, the late playwright and poet. Now, Ben Jonson's poem tells us certain things about William Shakespeare. He tells us that Shakespeare was uneducated. In Ben Jonson's words, he knew little Latin and less Greek. In Shakespeare's time, Latin was the medium of instruction for all subjects. So everything that was taught in school was taught in Latin. If Shakespeare knew little Latin, that meant that he had very little education. He also tells us that Shakespeare was at his best when he wrote when his socks were off. Many people think that this is a metaphorical message, that Shakespeare was writing best when he was unfettered. I like to think that in fact Ben Jonson is telling us something about William Shakespeare, that Shakespeare wrote his best plays when he wasn't wearing any socks. I like that idea. He also tells us that Shakespeare was very highly thought of by his contemporaries. In the poem, Ben Jonson compares him to the old Greek masters, to Sophocles and Euripides. And the fact that he was so highly thought of by his contemporaries might explain why the first folio was put together in 1623. That although the general public may have forgotten him only a few years after he left London, certainly playwrights and actors remembered him, and they remembered him enough to get together and put together the first folio some 7 years after his death. The other thing that we can say with some certainty is what Shakespeare didn't do. So we know that Shakespeare didn't go to university. If he knew little Latin, he wouldn't have been able to go to university. We know that he didn't look for a patron. Many writers at that time wrote things for a lord or a duke or an earl, hoping to get some money out of them. Shakespeare's company had a patron. It was the Lord Chamberlain, who was a powerful man at court. Every theatre company needed a patron of some kind to protect them. And Shakespeare's company had the Lord Chamberlain. But Shakespeare himself, personally, appears to have never had a patron. The other thing that's important is he didn't come from London. He came from Stratford-upon-Avon. And I'm pretty sure that the title of Bard of Avon was meant as an insult originally. Most of Shakespeare's contemporaries either came out of universities, like Christopher Marlowe, and were known as the university wits, or they came from London. Ben Jonson came from London, Thomas Nash came from London, Thomas Kyd came from London. Lots of them came from London. Shakespeare came from the sticks, from a small town in a rural community. And the other thing that Shakespeare didn't do was he didn't go to jail, which was unusual for playwrights at his time. In fact, he was never even arrested. Christopher Marlowe was assassinated in London when he was only 27. We know that Ben Jonson went to prison on 3 separate occasions, one for being in a duel with an actor who had disparaged Ben Jonson's writings. We know that after the Earl of Essex men put on a performance of Richard II, which is about a king who abdicates, Queen Elizabeth took exception to them performing the play and arrested the Earl of Essex, who was at that time her boyfriend. She'd later cut his head off. And she also arrested everybody who was involved in the production on the understanding that they might have known what the message of the play was supposed to be. Being a playwright, being an actor, was a dangerous job at the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. People died in duels, people were assassinated, people were thrown in jail. None of that happened to William Shakespeare. He appears as a man from the sticks who wanted to stay out of London politics, stay out of religious politics, not have a patron. Shakespeare stayed out of trouble. He wrote Henry IV Part 1 and 2 and Henry V, which pleased the Queen. It was a piece of Tudor propaganda. He stayed on the right side of the authorities, and although he took lots of risks with the censor, he always appears to have got round the censorship laws. So here we have an important understanding of what Shakespeare didn't do. Shakespeare is the most famous writer in the world. He's considered the greatest dramatist who ever lived. And there's good reason for that. He wrote the best tragedies and the best comedies and the best history plays. He had the best characters, the best drama and the best speeches. So how come we know so little about him? We know he was highly considered in his own lifetime. So how come there's so little biographical evidence about his life? Well, we know that even before his death, Shakespeare's world was starting to disappear. You remember that I told you that Shakespeare went back to Stratford when he was about 50 years old? Well, it was around that time that the Globe Theatre, which Shakespeare was most closely associated with, where the majority of his plays had first been performed, it was around that time that the Globe Theatre burned down. And around the time of his death, the house of Ben Jonson, his friend, also burned down. We may have lost lots and lots of records with regards to Shakespeare in both of those fires. The other thing that's important is that 26 years after Shakespeare died, the English Civil War broke out. So on one side you had the Roundheads, the Puritans, who hated theatre and in fact had gone to the trouble of closing down all the theatres in England. And on the other side you had the Cavaliers, the Royalists, the aristocrats. They looked down on the theatre as being lower class. Neither side was interested in preserving the legacy of the theatre. Both of them were interested in it being destroyed. The English Civil War helped to destroy institutions, families, traditions. It is highly likely that there is biographical evidence of Shakespeare's life that disappeared during the Civil War. So, in the next podcast, I'd like to talk to you about Macbeth. And specifically, I'd like to talk to you about where the idea for writing the play of Macbeth came from, why Shakespeare wrote a Scottish play, and what the story of the play is really about. Until then, I thank you for your time, and I will see you later. That was episode 2 of the Shakespeare podcast. If you like and subscribe this channel, you can help us in our belief that great literature is for everyone.